everybody. All good? How are you feeling?
Yay!
Yay! While everybody's locking to Slido, I'm sure you're all very comfortable with the tool. I'm curious what's going to be the answer to our first question about what made you say yes to our invitation today. It's an honor to welcome you here. My name is Lucia Klestincova. I'm a stand for elevating voices of changemakers among us who stand for bringing a new culture of feminine leadership into politics, policy, public affairs, all the beautiful bubbles that we're part of, which hopefully one day we will see transformed thanks to the values of femininity and feminism, which today we will also discuss which word is probably more appropriate or not, although this is not obviously an academic or researchy event. The objective is not to discuss the word, but the value that it stands for and the possibility that's behind it once we manage to empower each other in rolling out this new culture of feminine leadership. We've put together a beautiful set of speakers from across society, civil society, NGOs, researchers, politicians. And so before we dive deeper, we already see that we have a lot of fans of feminism among ourselves. So we thought that it's going to be kind of a no-brainer not to go into the why we're here and what's the point of having more gender-just societies. We kind of all get it. And the question is more how we get there. And so my invitation also for our distinguished speakers today was, let's start being as provocative and as action-oriented as we can, not to go into the conversations that all of us somehow followed in one way or another these past years. I wanted to check in with you. Last year, there was this report of European Parliament on gender-just foreign policy and security. Who in the room read the report? Have you heard of it? You heard of it. Who read it? Okay. Just wondering, because we were exchanging with the team around how these policy initiatives are somehow around us, but that's what they remain, initiatives on the past or papers in the drawers. And then we complain that we keep having the same conversation for years and years and nothing changes. And so the question is, what can we do in terms of our individual actions? So the day is going to be split into two panels. The first part will look into the challenges of female participation in politics and leadership, and the second one will look more deeply into security and foreign affairs. And then we will close. Is it my mic that just switched on? Okay. Then we will close with a working group where, building on inputs of stakeholders, we will develop some more concrete proposals forward. And obviously this comes at a pivotal moment in geopolitics and foreign affairs that makes us all feel very heartbroken. So I hope that all of us will leave with some sort of actionable commitment that will get us to have a different quality of this conversation next time we meet. So with this in mind, I'm happy to invite our first keynote among us, which is Anna Stürgkh, a role model of many young female and male aspiring politicians in Austria, a member of District Council Wieden, and former president of JUNOS Austria. So Anna will share with us her personal story of what it's like as a young woman getting into politics, but also we've shared during our prep call how it's almost the golden era for women who want to make it into politics, and it's not difficult for a woman to get on the ballot list, right? But like, do we get the spots that actually get us to get into the places of power and create the change, or do we play, you know, the card for some of the politicians who feel the need to have the cards filled, but then don't give women the real platform to create the change and bring the new culture? And so Anna will share with us about how her path was about using this opportunity and creating out of it what she desires as the new quality of politics in Austria. So Anna, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucia. Thank you, Joanna, for the invitation of sharing some of my own story. But before we go into that, I want to tell you about something I experienced yesterday. yesterday I started watching a new show. It's called The Inside Man on Netflix. I don't know whether any of you have started watching it. Can recommend. It's a show about murder, crime, and why people do things they never thought possible. So on the surface, it has nothing to do with what we're talking about today. But the first scene is set in the London Tube, and it shows a young woman being harassed by a young man. And one after the other, people around them start looking. And then they don't just start looking, but the first woman starts to film what is going on. And then the second one joins in and starts to film. And then the third one, and the fourth one is actually live streaming it. And then at the end, all the women stand up, I'm filming it, I'm filming it. You know, it's a very powerful moment. So it shows this strong female solidarity that actually leads to this young man being arrested by police in the next station. So we see these strong, independent women standing up to their oppressors. And then the next moment, the opening credits start. And it's this montage of the two faces of the main characters, as you may have guessed, a man and a man. And I thought, well, doesn't that feel familiar? Because we live in a society today where, in films, but also politics, we almost feel the need to show strong, independent women. In politics, we almost parade these strong female characters around. But at the end of the day, it's still the men who take center stage. So, having said that, like Lucia has already mentioned, I still believe that it has never been easier for women, ambitious women, to advance themselves in politics than it is today. But I also believe that that is a trap. So I first became active in politics about 10 years ago. And I hope we can all agree that today, and 10 years ago, it has become very difficult for especially centrist and leftist parties to be successful in politics if they don't have the right amount, the right quality of female candidates, of proving that they're actually doing something for women in politics, but also society. So, over those last 10 years, I could see that women were really sought after in politics. Space was made within the structures that are already there for women to fill. We were invited as women to join the game as long as those in power still made the rules. So yes, we could play along, but not change those rules. I've worked with many organizations over the last 10 years, and almost every male leader I've met has been adamant about how they want more women in politics, how they wanted to support women. And I believe that's what they thought, but it's not what I saw in their actions, at least not most of them. Rather, what I saw was women getting elected on boards, but then decisions still being made by the same old boys' club rules that have run politics over the last centuries. Alliances were still made over beer and football. When we come to election lists, like we've heard before, electoral lists, we all know we need women. And then in those conversations, those men who lead, they say, we need more women. I want a woman on the second place of the list, obviously. But then they say, but I don't have any. You know, there's none there. Because the one woman who you show them is too ambitious. The next doesn't have enough experience. And the third one just doesn't have the right skills. Now, I'm not saying that every woman is cut out for politics just because she's a woman. But what I am saying, and you've all come to a conference on gender and geopolitics, I think 60% have said you're a fan of feminism. So I don't have to tell you that we still see today that women in politics are judged by different standards than their male counterparts. Because if those men in power were honest with themselves, they're not where they are because they already had the experience before they came into the position. They're not there because they already had the right skill set. They're there because they were given opportunity to prove themselves. And when I talk to these men in power, I try to hold up a mirror to them. I try to make them see their double standards for themselves. I try to make them see that when they support the young, self-confident men that they see themselves in, but don't support the women, the strong, self-confident young women, because they're just not there yet. But when I have those conversations, I usually get two answers. The first one, as you can all imagine, is yes, but, and then you can enter whatever line you like. And the second one is actually even more interesting to me. The second answer I get from the men I talk to is, yes, but I've always, or I am, supporting you. So clearly, I support women. And I'd like to dissect that answer with you for a moment, because I think there's at least 3 interesting things to be said about this. First of all, I think it shows that there is a clear misunderstanding between supporting women or change systematically and having proteges. Second of all, I am eternally grateful for all the support that I've received by men and women. But I've put in a lot of hard work. I've spent a decade working on myself, working on proving myself, and working on making a name for myself, that one day I'd be invited to events like this out of my own right. So yes, I am eternally grateful, but no, it does not give you credit. And the third thing, and that is, I think, almost the most important thing, is that to me, it shines light on the crucial and underlying curse that is the fact that it is as easy today for women to progress in politics as it has ever been. And that is, when they say, but I support you, the subtext of it is, I support you as a woman. I support you as a female candidate. Women in politics, we are being taught or trained to think of ourselves as the female candidate. It almost becomes an identity, a unique selling point. But the problem is that unique selling point is only unique until there's other women around. So we're being taught to fear, more than anything, other ambitious women. When I first started out in our youth organization 10 years ago, I was used to being the only woman. I was the only woman in the room. I was the only woman at the table. And it was comfortable. I felt so secure and so safe in my position. And I remember how much it hurt when the men started talking about this new, talented young woman who came into our organization, about this new girl they'd met who they think could be a really good politician. I remember how threatened I felt and how jealous I was. And I used to be embarrassed to admit this. But today, I think that my admitting this to myself and a room full of people is actually the single most important step I have taken in becoming a real ally to other women in politics. I've, over the years, with a lot of hard work and a lot of help from amazing people, tried to turn myself around and my thoughts. So today, I don't feel threatened, I feel empowered. I don't feel jealous, I feel proud. And I don't see competition, I see partners. I used to think that leadership, that feeling powerful, would be based on having an influence on decisions or having the male candidates or the men in my organization respect me, follow my lead, want to hear what my thoughts are. I used to think that I should evaluate my leadership based on the media coverage we got or the influence we had on our mother organization. Last weekend, I stepped down as president of my organization. And the night after I did, we had a party. And a young woman who's active in our organization, she's the leader of one of our local branches. She came up to me and she handed me a picture. It was a Polaroid we took, the two of us, a couple of days after she first got elected. She handed it to me and she said, "I've had this picture in my wallet ever since we took it. And every time when I feel overwhelmed or I feel like I'm not good enough, it gives me confidence because you believed in me when I didn't." And so now I carry this picture and I carry it with me all the time as a constant reminder of what kind of leader I want to be, what kind of politician I want to be, and what kind of woman I want to be. So over the last 10 years, I've watched women put down other women in order to receive praise, especially from the men around them. I've seen women play by the rules that were given to us by others. Women trying to perform a sort of leadership that they thought was the one they had to do in order to be successful. And I don't blame any of them, because I am one of them. But if, like Lucia said, we are here today, not because we want to just congratulate all of us for being good feminists, not because we want to talk about what we already know, that it is important to have more female leadership in international politics. But if we really want to leave here today with an agency of change, then I hope that today, now in the panel following this, we are willing to really change those rules and not just play along. And I'm so excited to have the opportunity to talk with all of you and with the other panelists now about ways that we can really change the way that the game is played. Thank you.
Well done, thank you. I feel like I need a Slido question where we ask who got shivers listening to Anna, but we have another question ready about what is the one measure that you feel would change the reality. So you can, oh yeah, we still have that one running. I didn't know. That would be cool to see. Yes, what is the one word that you associate with gender just foreign policy? We just wanted to check in a little bit. What is the default emotion and association that we have within, since it's such a heavy word, sometimes called feminine and feminist and God knows what, and it can be a source of divides rather than connection. So we just want to establish that there's all kinds of values behind it, and obviously the most important for us today is to agree on what is the actionable piece that each of us can bring to our communities. And so now, thank you, Anna, once again. I would like to invite our first panel distinguished guests to join us somewhere here on our beautiful stage. Please come on in. We have with us Jéromine Andolfatto, who is a policy and campaigns officer for European Women's Lobby. Then we have Rick Zednik, advisor and secretary of the Women Political Leaders Board. We have Joanna Burnos, leader of Leaders Institute, an alliance of her advisory board member. So, and Anna stays with us as well. So thank you all for being with us. Now that we've heard a bit of the reality check, what it's like for a young woman to start going through this experience, and what stayed with me were words like trap, curse, beer clubs, jealousy, empowered. So I felt it was very powerful. So now let's open it up to a bit more generic. I don't want to say generic, but like the broader policy conversation. My first question will be for Jéromine about what is the reality really on the ground? What do the numbers tell us from your perspective of European Women's Lobby? Where are we at, without like overwhelming you with stats, but just to kind of set the scene in terms of where we're at in terms of female participation in politics, and also what is the relation in terms of seeing the correlation or not in the member states where some sort of best practice has been established in terms of supporting female participation in policy and politics.
Thank you. Yeah, okay, it's working. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. So yeah, I'm Jéromine from the European Women's Lobby. So I will talk more from the European angle and European perspective. So for instance, the Parliament and the Commission. So we know the fact, as you say, but it doesn't hurt reestablishing them a little bit, as you're inviting me to. There is progress. So it's encouraging when you see the Commission, half of the commissioners are women, the Parliament is 39% members of the European Parliament are women. But still, we can do much better because there is still important vertical segregation. So women do not get equal access to power, although they have equal skills or the expertise to do so. Just a really recent example, when you look at the COVID crisis and health minister in members of the European Union, member states of the European Union, only a quarter of health minister were women, which is quite concerning when you see that women were disproportionately affected by the COVID crisis. So that's why also equal representation is important, so you can convey the interest and the concerns of women to the highest level of decision-making and on the political agenda. But there is also horizontal segregation, and that's quite apparent in the European Parliament, for instance. So despite being close to gender balance in the gender parliament, when you look at the committees within the parliament, you can see that the Women's Rights and Gender Equality Committee has about 89% women in its members. But if you look at, for instance, the Foreign Affairs Committee, it's 69% men. If you look at the Security and Defense Committee, it's 77% men. So I was quite curious also today to see the audience, although this is not decision-making positions, but when you go to gender equality events, it's usually full of women in the audience, also male allies, but there is a minority of men usually, and I felt like because today is about security and foreign affairs and gender, there might be a bit more men, and I think this is the case. So yeah, that's for a bit setting the pictures, and you asked me about some concrete example for member states.
There are member states which fare better in terms of participation. Yeah. Is there a correlation with policies they've established to boost it?
So in terms of member states, I think the Nordic countries, that would be a surprise to no one, fare better in terms of representation. So Sweden, for instance, in the parliament there are 47% women, and some other European states like Hungary are only 14%. So in Sweden, I think the gender, the culture, the political norms are quite different. So, but you have other countries, for instance, like Belgium, who have implemented legislated mandated quotas for their national, but also like regional level, etc. And they have, in 2019, they had 42% women, so they were more than gender balance in the parliament. And experience has shown that in countries implemented positive measures, the representation of, like, equal representation of women is fast-tracked. If you let it to natural progress to happen, or voluntary quotas, for instance, this progress can happen, but it is slower, and also it can be lost. It's not necessarily sustainable. So for instance, Iceland had voluntary party quotas, and in 2017 they had an election, and before this election you had 48% women in the national parliament, but after the election this dropped by 10 percentage points, because 2 new parties entered the parliament and they did not implement voluntary gender quota. So that's why it's important for legislation to bring men and women on the same equal footing when exercising all rights to run for election, for instance, and to have access to decision making.
Awesome, thank you, Jéromine. Speaking of Iceland, Rick just got back from Iceland last week, was it? Where the women political leaders hosted their annual conference. And out of the many messages that you've discussed over there, there's one powerful one that we thought would be nice to bring into the conversation today. We also have a slide illustrating a mood in the society. I don't know what's the best way of labeling it, but Rick will share with us what is the bias, the stereotype, the societal story of all of us wanting or not being ready to support female candidates for politics.
Yeah, thanks very much, Lucia. Yeah, great. So indeed, Women Political Leaders has, since 2018, done research in G7 countries and now increasingly to more countries on perceptions of the public towards men and women and their suitability for leadership. Okay, so it's not looking at who's in what jobs, it's looking at what do people think about when they think about who is a leader. You know, do they think of masculine or feminine traits? And this is I don't know how well you can see this graph that's up here on the screen, but there are 4 things I just want to highlight as you look at it. The first of which, so this question, this is just one, I'm only showing one slide, and the one question that's this slide is highlighting is the one is, are you very comfortable with a woman as head of government? Because our belief is that to vote for somebody, you should be very comfortable with them. And you'll see these are percentage answers across these different countries, that in no country was 70% of the population very comfortable with a woman as head of government. Okay, the UK topped out at 69%. So that's the first thing just to sort of look at, right? In none of these G7 countries, these are industrialized, affluent societies where women have, in theory, made a lot of progress, perhaps more than in other parts of the world. Second thing I just want to highlight is that the 2 countries that were lowest on this year after year might surprise you, at least in one case, Germany, and the other one perhaps less surprising, Japan. Japan is not a place where women have achieved great heights in political leadership, but Germany obviously is. And yet, the public perception is that, for whatever reason, the German public is not very comfortable with a woman as head of government overall, right? So their numbers are in the 30s and 40s that we're saying that. Strange, I thought. Third thing I just want to highlight is the trends, right? So the trends here, really interesting if you look. So this is 2018, 19, 20. They're going up, and in 21, sort of hovering there. Now I want to freeze for a second. So we have lived through 3 very strange years. 2020 and 21, very dominated by COVID. And you can see that where there was a little positive trend from 18 to 19, it really continued, in some cases accelerated from 19 to 20 in how comfortable people were with women heading government. And I think that's not a coincidence, right? I think the fact is there was a form of leadership that was necessary and that was widely exhibited in many places around the world that was necessary to cope with a crisis like a pandemic. It was one of solidarity. It was one of looking out for the weakest links in society, right? What can we do to make sure that everybody is safe? Everybody's taken care of, because if everybody isn't taken care of, then none of us are taken care of, right? So that was the pandemic. So those numbers went up. Come to this year, steep decline. What's the difference? So I'm not the researcher on this, but I asked the researchers, I said, obviously that must be Ukraine. The people doing the research said, well, we're not comfortable drawing conclusions. I'm going to draw that conclusion. I mean, what else has been different this year from the last couple of years, especially when you talk about the countries that we're talking about? And to me, my interpretation is the public thinks they need something different in this kind of crisis, right? This is war. This is armed conflict where most of, unfortunately, the figures that we see dominating the headlines, dominating the news, the visuals, et cetera, as leaders of this conflict, are people like Putin, Zelensky, Biden, right? Scholz, Macron, Erdogan. They're men. There have been some notable exceptions. I would put von der Leyen up there. And some of the Nordic prime ministers have also been right at the forefront. But for the most part, the leaders that have been visible have been male leaders. And when women have been in the news on television, it's, okay, Ukraine has a crisis, the men will fight, the women take the children out of the country. Yeah. I'm giving you my personal interpretation. Absolutely. The data, the research is a quantitative research. It's not qualitative. They didn't ask people, why do you feel this way? So we are all left to interpret it, and I'm giving you my interpretation. So I'll just wrap up on saying, this to me is fascinating because it shows something that's out there, something that's real. It's perceptions, but perceptions are real, and it affects decisions. So I leave us with that, and I'm gladly talk more about that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And since these facts affect decisions, they also powerfully affect our individual decisions. As women in the room, who has ever considered running in politics? One? Did you? Yes. You're working beautifully, beautiful. We would be happy to then hear some sort of a testimonial, what kind of support you'd love to welcome. See, this is all out there. There's also reputation of politics. There's the noise that women are a part of, the families that dissuade them from doing it because there's so much violence and so much danger and so much everything that they don't want them to be part of, disregarding of the love and admiration they have for their leadership. It's big, and so we thought it would be very useful to also address the individual empowerment piece, the inner work that every woman needs to go through first before she even starts admitting to herself that it could be a thing she would be open to considering, and then slowly floating the agenda with other people around her, the parties, the sponsors, the media, God knows, like the path is really huge. And so with Joanna, we thought it would be interesting to look into what are really the features of leadership academies, of the coaching, the female leadership work that we stand for with love, but we also feel the hardship and the layers and layers that these female leaders need to get through before we even start seeing them out in the spotlights. And so later on in the second panel, we will start looking into like, what does it really mean in practice? How can we support them? But so Joanna, why don't you share a little bit, what is it that you see when you're working with the female leaders, specifically in Poland, but also Alliance of Her, with Alliance for Her, across Europe? What are the features that they need to work on primarily, and how do you support them?
First and foremost, I would like to thank you for having me here, and congratulations on the great keynote speech to Anna. I am really thrilled to hear your story and your, courageous confession also, which clearly shows your maturity. And the female leadership is very much about maturity. Coming back to your question, first and foremost, again, we need to emphasize one thing. Female leaders are human beings. And very often in the public space, we are forgetting about it. Because we have huge demands if it goes about the ambitions, about the portfolio, about the expectations, about the level of education, experience as well towards female leaders. But in the same time, we need to remember how much mental support, well-being support they need. Because very often it is like that they have this inner will and inner expectation, I would say, to over-deliver, to prove that they are professional, to do double work in order to prove that they are equal with men. So what I do on my, let's say, daily basis, because I'm running a consulting and training company, and most of the clients are women, is going, down to the heart level and to the spiritual level, how weird it may sound in our, political environment in here. So I always encourage women to look at themselves by concentrating on the 4 pillars, which are the so-called 4 selves. The self-awareness, so being able to evaluate ourselves from the perspective of the constraints that we have inner side, the limitations, but also the great talents that we have. And we very often judge ourselves in the strictest way. Women are perfect at that. And the second one, self-acceptance. So being able to accept the fact that we are all not perfect. No one is. And being able to accept also the circumstances that very often are not working in favor for us in the political environment, in the business environment. We had COVID. Right now we are facing the biggest crisis since the World War II in Europe. So this is also something that creates totally dramatically different circumstances for the female leadership. And we need to be aware of that, and we need to accept that. And then we go to self-management. We all women love being on our own, meaning managing whole scope of duties related to home life, to professional work as well. We are team builders. We love teamwork. We are contributors and so on. But we a little bit lack the ability to delegate tasks as well. And all the women that are dreaming of female leadership, of the career in management, in politics, they need to be aware of the fact that they need to have the whole team of supporters on the daily basis. They need to have partners at their homes. They need to have advocates also for themselves, because this is something we are constantly forgetting, that each and every woman has to surround herself not only with women, but only with men who would mention her name in the room full of opportunities. So it's not only about how good I am, but also how do other people perceive me and will advocate for me. And last but not least, self-development. So being ready for like life learning process, what we are experiencing constantly, and being able to deliver, to expand our knowledge, our experiences, risking at a time, from time to time. Very often it is like that we are encouraged to take risks, especially by different, male coaches and so on. Go out of your comfort zone. Come on, we are all having, 24 hours. Let's go for it. Let's meet the goals and so on. But and then we are so strict for ourselves. I'm not good enough. I cannot, tick all the issues on my agenda. But your day is not 24 hours day of a male. It's a little bit different, come on, in the vast majority of the cases. So do not compare yourself to the male leaders, to the goal setters that are crazy, that they have their job done by female supporters at their homes. And there is something of a big importance that I would like to emphasize as well, the role of self-confidence. The research of one of the foundations in Poland showed that 50% of women lack of self-confidence. And this is the major limitation that they have, that they discovered in themselves. This is something that limits them from, going for leadership positions or running for the elected offices. And finally, thank you very much for underlining the role of the Alliance of Her. This, in my particular case, is the life-changing experience. The academy that was formerly named European Women's Academy was a really, I want to emphasize it once again, life-changing experience, because it gave me such a great boost of self-confidence. And the fact that I was surrounded by other women who are role models, who shared their success stories, who were mentoring us, who were our buddies, that I could always approach. I could send an email to them, I could call them, and they are there to help me. And you know what? It turned out that we all women across Europe shared the same limitations, the same glass ceilings, and challenges. What was quite surprising for me, because I saw the statistics. Here in Scandinavia, it's, they are so open-minded. and they are so pro-female. But it turns out that we need to do the same work among our parties, inside our parties, and the processes are very, very similar, unfortunately, but in general the climate around female leadership is quite optimistic, and I will stick to that.
Thank you so much. Before I ask Anna to react, I was wondering if the men in the room would be willing to share how their self-esteem issues are going, because sometimes we wonder if it's really just a female issue, or are we making it a female issue? Rick, do you have would you vote in a survey that yes, I have self-esteem issues, or no?
At this stage in my life, I can do that.
You're self-confident enough to admit that, yes. See?
Yeah.
I also wanted to invite us that there's this Slido thing going. So please, if you have any questions burning or even not, please start putting them in the Slido, and we'll start giving ourselves floor also for more questions from all of you. Also, hello to everybody who's online, and we would love to hear from you as well. If you go to FNF social media channels, you will also find the live stream links that you can share with your community. And so now, Anna, I would love to hear from you. You're good? Yes. You're good? It's all the wisdom coming out. No, but seriously, I feel like we're already peeling the onion further than I usually hear it going, because there's just so much stigma around thinking that if women put themselves forward as leaders, it's almost they are supposed to serve and they should be grateful for giving the platform to serve, as if their personal needs were supposed to be disregarded, and thinking that they are not going to sabotage their performance if they are not taken care of. And so, Anna, I would love to hear from you, how does all this resonate in terms of specifically the talent pipeline from what you've seen in the landscape around you when you were, for instance, looking for who's going to be your successor in the organization, or at the local government that you're part of? How does it really look when the male politicians say, oh, I don't have sufficient, the pipeline is not full enough? What is it that you feel, based on your anecdotal experience, that has women check themselves out of the competition, that holds them back, especially because these decisions often happen during childbearing years, and it almost feels like a zero-sum game of sorts, that if you put yourself forward, there's gonna be a price to be paid in your private life. So what do you feel is the challenge in filling the talent pipeline?
I just don't want to. Okay, that's fine then. Sorry, I just didn't want to hurt any of your guys' ears by having two. There's a lot to unpack in that question, but I'll try to just kind of stick to a couple points. When you said, how did we cope? How do I feel about talent pipelines? I think 100% I agree with you. I'm in the Alliance of Her right now, and it is definitely a transformative experience, even just by being this room where you really aren't in competition. Because you can keep telling yourself you don't want to feel competition with other women, but when you've experienced this once, that you truly are in a room full of amazing women who just aren't your competition, you start to have different types of conversations. You start to react differently to what those women are doing, and it really helps you, at least for me, it really helped me translate kind of those conversations into rooms where I am with women who, on paper, compete for the same political positions as me. So that has really been transformative, and I think there's definitely value to those kind of playgrounds almost, where you get to work with other women. But I think that's one part, but it's just not enough, because within your own party, first of all, it's a lot harder to create those kind of spaces, because it's just a fact. You are competing for the same roles. You are competing for the few seats that are available. So it's quite hard to establish that. And from my experience, so like I said, when I started out, I used to be the only woman in the room most of the time. and now that I left, you know, the board that came after me, my successor, she's a woman. Her 2 vice presidents are women. Her board is 5 women, 4 men. So, and we don't have a quota. None of these women were elected because they were women. 2 of those women actually won elections against male candidates because they were the better candidates. And as annoying as it is, because it's not a blueprint, I think the way that we did this was just putting in the work of actually taking time to provide opportunities for those women that you see, and you have to make that conscious decision as a leader to go to young women and say, you should do this. You should run for this, and go to the male leaders who say, I don't think she's cut out for it, and tell them, well, you know what, she's going to try anyways. And like I said, you know, I think that's where the issue comes in, because kind of like quotas, you know, yes, they can help us get better numbers, but they don't change the way that politics work. And so you might end up, like I see it, for example, in one of our former governments run by the Conservatives and the far right, they had equal female ministers as male ministers. That didn't make them feminist. That didn't make them do female politics. They did no female policies. And on top of that, most of the female ministers, they were just kind of pushed to the side, you know. The ones making the decisions were still the men. So I think what I'm trying to say, to kind of wrap up my thoughts, is, first of all, there is a lot of soft power and soft power work that needs to be done, which again I know is annoying because it's not a blueprint that you can just adopt, but it's important. And second of all, I think I still believe very much that we need to change the rules how politics is done. And what I mean by that is small things. Like yesterday I was talking to a colleague who's also in politics, female colleague, and we said, you know, for example, in Germany, when they had the first discussion rounds and how the government was going to look like and what the government's plans were going to be, those discussions, those debates, they ended at 6 o'clock at night every night. They didn't run until midnight like they usually would. They stopped them. And that is a small change, but it is an important change because it changes the way that you can live your life besides politics. And like you said, you know, we can imagine a world where it's not the woman's job to look after the children or the household, but at the end of the day, today the fact is they still do. And as long as I'm prevented from doing both, I will have to choose one or the other, and I will end up probably choosing my private life. So small changes like that, I think will have a huge impact if we continue to change that course of action, how politics is done.
Thank you. Now I'd like to come to you, Jéromine, and ask you as the European Women's Lobby representative, what do you hear from the policy campaigner perspective? Because we've now heard all that stands in the way at an individual level, like how do we need to support each other, the power of the networks. But what does for you transpire through this as an agenda that you can take on in addition to what's the usual policy solutions narrative in town? And not just making it about a quota, but also I was wondering, like, what do you feel is the biggest myths surrounding the conversation about the solutions? Because the quota is obviously so explosive that oftentimes it can stop or not the conversation unless we are given the space to actually explain how it's the first step towards a larger package, right, of like compensation and fines and all that. So what do you feel would be the most beneficial way of taking all these individual barriers conversation into an effective policy conversation that gives us a different result ultimately?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, it's working. Okay, good. I'll start by the end of the question and also responding to Anna on the quota bit. So it's true, it's not a miracle solution for sure. What we believe is that it's mandatory, but it should be a temporary, like a tool to a specific, like a mean to an end. Because even if it's true, it's really important to have women that would support feminist politics. It's not just about having a woman there accessing power. It is also about being able to exercise your democratic right on an equal footing. And at the moment, the challenge is that women, in all their diversity, don't have the same right compared to men. So that's also why legislation should like establish this equal footing, this fair, same rule of the game for both women and men and for all women. So I think it's also about that and about when the voters go to the booth, having the possibility to really feel represented by a diversity of candidates, not just maybe like white male or, you know, so it's also about this, I think, but indeed it's not like a miracle solution. And what we see as crucial in terms of like, you know, getting more female leadership in foreign policy, in EU policies or national policies is, as you mentioned, the care and all the connected policies around. So it's also about raising awareness and education. Education is crucial. But when you mentioned really well the fact that as a woman in politics, time is of essence. And if you have care burden at home, being like childcare, elderly care, as a woman, this falls mostly on you. So that's why it's important that the different countries and the EU also develop appropriate, affordable, high quality care services so that women don't take all this care burden on their shoulders and they have the time to participate in political, economical, cultural life if they are willing to, and like a lot of women are willing to, but at least having this possibility. And on that, I think it was also mentioned a bit by Anna, I believe, violence against women and girls is one of the barriers and one of the things on which we need to do a lot of effort and issue appropriate policies. Because I'm sure you have more experience than I do on that, but from the policy perspective, there was this really interesting survey from the Interparliamentary Union in 2018 saying, well, highlighting the fact that 85% of women members of the parliament surveyed had experienced psychological violence. 46 of them had received death threats, rape threats. So that's also something that women take into consideration when they question themselves, should I be running, should I not be running, even if I have the skills, even if I have maybe support system around me, because these are really concrete threats. And online violence, for instance, is really, really important too, because it's used to silence women that want to express their voices, that want to represent their voices. So it's really important to have the right policies, and for that, there is an European directive coming up, which we think is really encouraging on many levels at the European Women Lobby, but we would like to see more all forms of violence included, including going further on online violence. And in terms of the myth, well, I think, sorry to disappoint, but most of the myths I have coming in mind are linked to quotas. So maybe, well, one of the main one would be, you know, like both the fact that some people feel like when you have quotas, again, which are not a miracle and should only be temporary, but when you have quotas, it infringes on freedom of choices. I think it's a deep misconception because, as I said earlier, this exercise of your democratic rights should be done on an equal footing. And if women are not able to play by the same rule of the game, if with equal merit they don't have access to this decision-making position, they can. Quota doesn't mean you're going to put necessarily a woman on the job. Quota on electoral list, for instance, means that women will be put at an electable place when they have the skills, and they would be elected if voters want to see them at these places. So that's one of the first things I wanted to tackle. And yeah, the basically so-called merit principle. There are plenty of qualified women, but with equal merit, you don't have the same chances. So I think, yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
I just want to chime in on quotas, if I may.
Of course.
We actually have quotas in every single country in Europe. In terms of, we have geographical quotas, right? In the European Parliament, for example, we say, okay, Germany gets 99 seats, Malta gets 6. Or whatever, right? Why is that okay? And it's somehow not okay to say we should have 50% of them men and 50% of them women. Like, why do we accept it in one way and not in another, which is, I think, not less important to people's lives, arguably even more important. So that's the first thing I just wanted to say. And the second thing is, quotas are often described as being a very blunt instrument. It's like, you know, you have to set a number and then it's got to be achieved or not. There's so many different ways of creating incentives or disincentives for parties and for the electorate. So it doesn't have to be just sort of set this number, but you can say, okay, you have to have certain number of politicians on your list, or you have to have them at certain places on your list, or there are a lot of different things you can offer funding or take away funding. So anyway, I just think quotas are not as black and white an issue as they're often perceived to be.
We should rebrand it as a policy instrument. We should rebrand it.
Excuse me, I would like to add one more sentence about quotas, because I very often hear the sentence, sorry, that quotas are controversial. This is the entry sentence that opens the discussion on quotas in Poland. And by using this frame, we are, limiting the possibilities, and we are weakening the message as well. Sorry. So it is also very important to be prepared with the right narrative on quotas, because according to the global gender gap from 2020, the parity, the equality in terms of social, legal, and economic laws in Poland between and Central Eastern European countries actually as a whole, it is being counted that it will take 128 years. So we cannot afford of waiting that long. And all the managers and CEOs, female leaders that I come across, they always emphasize that I wouldn't like to be a parity manager. I was appointed due to my competences, but I'm aware of the fact that we cannot afford waiting that long. That is why I support it for the new generations, for my colleagues. And this is something that is crucial, that we need to emphasize this attitude and those role models who are aware of the fact that it's also necessary from the economic point of view. Because in Poland, for example, more than 50% of consumers, of voters, of citizens are women. So from the economic point of view, we cannot waste this potential. And consumers are also becoming more and more aware of the fact, and they are demanding these changes. So I think that this is something that cannot be stopped. And we do not need to be sorry about quotas. And starting the discussion with the sentence, I know they are controversial, but.
And also not present them as some sort of a social measure, doing some sort of a favor to the women who want to contribute, but also seeing it. And in the second panel, we will also open the aspect of intersectionality, that it's not just the men-female diversity question, but how do we actually generate solutions as politicians and policymakers if we are not representative of all the colors of our society, right? Rika, I wanted to ask you, I just can't avoid the temptation of asking you as being the man on the panel, yes. How do we convert the men who are somehow standing on the sidelines, not really staying as tactical supporters when it fits them, which is also what Anna mentioned sometimes happens, but how do you really onboard them to become a stand for diversity and female empowerment because they understand what's at stake and what's the value for the society? That is one question. And the second is the one which has been upvoted there on top, if you would like to comment on that. No one has drawn attention so far to the international politics yet. Le Pen, Meloni, Truss got a lot of attention recently. What are your thoughts on their performance? I don't know if that's can be somehow correlated to the work you're doing, but if you can touch upon both aspects, thank you.
I'll actually try to connect those two questions
together.
together.
Yeah, thank you. I knew you can do that.
The connection I would make is that you cannot draw a conclusion from an individual about a whole entire group, right? So Marine Le Pen is not representative of anything other than Marine Le Pen. She's not representative of women. She's not representative of women in politics. She's not representative of French women in politics. She is Marine Le Pen. And I would say that same thing, if you're going to ask me to try to represent, or even speak on behalf of, men, that's a pretty tall task, right? There's about 3.5 billion of us that I'd have to speak for. We're all very different. There's not one size fits all. But that's the important message, right? Any of you who've done any marketing, communications, you need to understand your target audience. And, I like to think of it as a spectrum, right? So there are men who are very uncomfortable with talk of feminism or women in leadership. And then there are men who are very comfortable. And so you can't address them both at the two ends of the spectrum in the same way. nor can you address those who are in the middle. And so I actually like to think of it as sort of like, think of them as 5 stages on a ladder. At the bottom are sort of your opponents, at the top of your champions. Right in the middle are your people who are undecided. But on either side of that undecided, you've got some people who are maybe a little skeptical or supportive. So think about those 5 steps and say, okay, where is this person? You know, if someone in your family or someone you work with that you're trying to get them to do a little bit more, say, okay, where do I think this person is in their journey? You know, if they are undecided, you know, maybe they need something passive. And then once they start to attend things, you know, maybe they need to vote or they need to donate money or they do something where it's not necessarily exposing themselves in a way that makes them feel vulnerable. Then they can be more active. They can attend an event like this. And then in an event like this, maybe they start to speak up. You know, so there's different steps on that journey. Determine where they are and then help them take the next step. So that would be my advice in terms of trying to get men to be more involved, is just think about where are they, and then there are different steps for each.
Thank you. I'll have Anna jump in. Also, if you could answer a question there, which one is your geopolitical challenge that gives you sleepless nights? I don't know if there's another one that you like, and then we'll give floor to the sir here.
I'm trying to think where to start because I'm not entirely comfortable with how you answer that question. First of all, because I think it's a bit easy to say I can't speak for all men, because at the end, yes, of course you can't. But at the end of the day, if we are generalizing, then yes, you can, because just like I'm asked to speak for women in politics, I'm not claiming that that my experience is the same as every other woman in politics. But I can say that I'm generalizing some of my experience, and I think that's a bit of an easy way out to say I can't speak for all. And the second point is, when we talk about men, like how we can get men as allies, I agree. I know a lot of the work is on our part. That's just kind of how it is. Something that I've experienced is actually just making them see my experience goes a huge, long way, because very brief personal example. My husband is also in politics, and whenever we show up, even to private functions with our family, you know, and it comes to the topic of politics, they will ask him what he thinks, not me. And after a while, you know, one of those events, I said to him, I said, you know, this pisses me off so much, and he didn't realize. And ever since, you know, he will make an effort to kind of step aside and look at me and say, well, what do you think? So yes, it is kind of up to us to show our experience, but I would also like to hear what other men can do in order to get men there, because I don't think it's fair that the whole burden is being put on women. With regards to the question about Le Pen and these women, I actually think they are representative of women in politics, because to me they represent the fact that if we have female leaders, again, not all of them, we can look at, for example, Jacinda Ardern, who is very different in that regard, but we don't see a feminine leadership. And all these women have in common that they are not feminine leaders, they're female leaders, but their style of leadership is not what we would call a feminine leadership, or, you know, I actually prefer calling it something like an empathetic leadership, because then it clearly doesn't exclude men. And I think, so in that regard, I think they are representative of the fact that most women who are successful in politics today don't show feminine qualities, just like most men that are successful in politics don't show feminine qualities, which they could. So in that regard, I think this also, just now what you showed earlier with Germans saying, oh, we don't want a woman in power. Well, obviously they had Merkel, but yes, she was called, you know, Mother Merkel, but, you know, yeah, not necessarily the most feminine, empathetic leader there's ever been.
Thank you, Anna. This is a very powerful distinction that all of us are trying to somehow start incorporating into the conversation, because it removes a lot of divides and confusion also about like where we're trying to get with this whole debate. I will now try to do a round of questions from the audience, and I would like to ask you, our panelists, to take notes and just choose whichever question you like so that we can get through them as effectively as we can. Please also introduce yourselves, which organization you're part of.
I'm one of the guides in the House.
Would you mind, sorry, apologies, we have a camera there in the back. Would you mind turning around so that the guests online can see you as well. Thank you.
Kurt Geisert, I'm one of the guides in the House of European History. I agree with you, Anna, when you said 6 o'clock in the evening. Before I worked for the representation of the state of Baden-Württemberg, and I advocated for midday events instead of evening events because they are family friendlier.
Do you have a question? No, thank you for the contribution. You had a question, right? Thank you. Yeah, if there's lunch served with them as well, yeah. Because then the women end up not eating ever. Please.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. Two questions,
Would you mind introducing
or
yourself?
rather, sorry,
Thank you.
I'm Atife. I'm doing my PhD in gender studies, and I work for Ethical Leadership Association here in Brussels. And my feminist activism started like 20 years ago, I would say, because I'm Iranian, and I had to. With so much oppression, we had to. And I would really recommend a look into the Iranian women activism, because years and decades of oppression has brought us to this point. And more than 60% of university students in Iran are women. And that is the way they lead the change. It was never what I see in Iranian society as opposed to the European society, for example. It was the education played the first role. You speak about self-development and all of that. It was long before that, because we could not do anything other than education. And I still see that missing here. I see that a lot going about the gender quota, which I agree with you. I see a lot in the danger of just meeting the gender quota happening here. I see incompetent women. I cannot tell you how many women in the European Parliament I have spoken with, and somewhere in the conversation it comes out something very anti-feminist, very radical, and it doesn't matter which political party they come from. It's like engraved there, and that is because there has been no awareness. And then we are shifting to something that I see as a power struggle. On one hand, I can say this is a transition period, that women should assume the power until a balance is created. On the other hand, why are we repeating that pattern that men have been doing for years, assuming that power? Why aren't we taking a responsibility of saying, okay, it's not about me being in power, it's about me having the essential knowledge for myself, for my next woman. I've been living here for 10 years in Brussels now, struggling with finding the job. And if you look at everyone who looks at my CV, it's like, wow. But with that struggle, any person in 10 years, and I have a good network, any person who helped me with one project here, another there, was a man. It was never a woman. And
yes,
I know
we'll
so
touch
many
upon
more
the
women.
sisterhood as well. Would you mind wrapping up? Thank you.
Sorry?
Would you mind wrapping up your
Sure.
comment?
So that
Thank
is
you.
the point that I would suggest in all the studies, all the brilliant works that you're doing. This awareness is the part missing. It's not about having men supporting us when we are not supporting each other in the first place.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have other? Yes, please, in the back. Is there any other questions, or then we'll go to the panelists, and then we will wrap this panel up so we can have the coffee break.
Hello, I'm Remy. I work for an organization called Forbidden Colors. We work on LGBTQ. We work for LGBTQ communities inside the European Union. It's basically your question on self-esteem and man that made me thinking as well. Basically, yeah, I mean, as a man, I can also say that I have troubles with self-esteem. I have the feeling sometimes that I don't deserve to speak out and speak out for my community and so on. But I always ask myself where this lack of self-esteem comes from, and that's also come because the receiver of my work, politicians, don't always take my work seriously. It's not that I don't have access to these politicians, it's the way that politicians treat us also that is not being taken seriously. Whenever I have a meeting, one of our programs that we do is on that's also why I'm here today, is on geopolitics, is on how Russian oligarchs are financing anti-gender and anti-LGBTQ movements in Europe. I brief politicians on this. At the same time, when I arrive during this meeting, I already see the rainbow flag and the photographer arriving, because I love to take a picture with a rainbow flag with me, while I'm actually there to discuss something I believe is, especially in these times of war, really seriously. I'm talking about Russian oligarchs and about how they finance anti-LGBTQ efforts in Europe. And at the same time, politicians only want to meet us because it's fun to take a picture with a rainbow flag and so on. So that's basically what my question is also to you, to us as representatives of feminine communities. Do you also feel that the way that they treat your issues is also not taking as serious whenever you approach policymakers.
Oh, yes. So I would like to give 1 minute to each of our panelists. You can choose whichever comment you want to react to, also whichever of the Slido questions, and then we will wrap up this panel. Thank you. Who feels ready? Yes, please go.
To refer what you have said and raise the subject of Iranian women that we are all admiring for years now, and the role of education. This is something that is basic. This should be basic. This is something that is so crucial, but it needs to be implemented and started in our homes. And this is something that we are also lacking as the human beings, I think. The role of rising in the right way of boys or girls, and boys and girls. This is something that we need to retrieve, all of us as parents, for example, because for the new generations, that's my observation, certain things are clear and obvious. These are the older generations who, in most of the cases, complicate things. And this is something that we need to be totally aware of, that this is very important to give the floor to all those young speakers and also the representatives of all the communities and treat them seriously. And we very often forget about one thing, that we are the employers of the politicians. And we need to demand, and this is our goal, to choose the right ones. Of course, it is something that sounds, totally basic and very general. But the education on the very local level is crucial. And this is something what I'm experiencing in Poland. You know how the situation looks like in Poland if it goes about the human rights, because women's rights are human rights. So this is about going very to the nano-zip code level. And this is also our task before the next elections of 2024, the European elections. So we need to do the job on the daily basis in our local communities.
Okay, sorry. Thanks. Yeah, I'm just gonna touch upon a bit on the last question, and I think on your question too. So yes, women are tokenized, so it's not only about representation, obviously, it's also about mainstreaming these gender equality concerns and issues on the policy agenda, and making sure that the policy, from its design to implementation to monitoring, is gender sensitive, and that there is this gender lens. And there was also a question touching upon, I think, gender budgeting earlier. So it's not only about, issuing policy recommendations or action plan or strategies. It's also about, giving the resource, giving the means so that you can implement, so that the different, DGs, the different member states can implement this kind of policy and really do the work. So yeah, it's not only about having a woman for the photo opportunity, for sure. And in terms of networks and, women supporting each other and education. I can talk for the European Women's Lobby, so we are putting in place some, networks. So, for instance, for youth, young feminists and potential candidate to election, for instance, we have this Youth Agora. The next edition is mid-September. So, if any young woman, so that's considered 18 to 30 years old, is interested and is a feminist activist, it's basically a boot camp. Well, this time online because of COVID and limitation, but bringing together European feminists, talking about their activism in politics, what are their concerns, what solutions they see, etc. And the aim is then to streamline that in our work. And we also have a training on online violence for female candidates. For now, it is called Her Net, Her Rights training. For now, it's focusing on Nordic countries, but we hope we can expand with appropriate resources. So obviously, we're dedicated to working on that, and yeah.
So I'm just going to address 2 points quickly in 1 minute. First of which, Anna, to the point where you were talking about is, what is Marine Le Pen representative of or whatever. I think the danger that I was trying to address is that what happens is there are still too few women in high office. And when one is there, it's taken as representative of how all women will perform. So if Liz Truss is seen to have failed as prime minister, they say, oh, we tried that, we're not going to have another woman as prime minister again, which is nonsense, obviously, right? If Boris Johnson fails, they don't say, okay, we're not going to have another male prime minister again. So that was part of what I was trying to say there, is don't sort of take one data point and then assume that applies to all. The other thing is just to the point about, so if you go to see somebody and they want a photo op, it happens, in terms of like, we call it pink washing, right? Like if they say, oh, great, we can have, I'm a male politician, I want to show I'm a feminist and I'm going to have a picture with some women's rights group or something like that. Or I want to show that I'm very tolerant on LGBT issues and I want to have, a rainbow flag behind me or whatever. Obviously, they're not doing it for the right reasons, but it's important to them. So that means you have leverage. You can actually use that to your advantage and say, we are not going to have this meeting with you, which clearly you value, unless you meet some conditions. So that would be my advice, is just use that opportunity. And if they don't meet your conditions, don't do the meeting.
Beautiful, thank you.
We've heard about the lines of her now from the both of us. So I'd like to wrap up my part by maybe giving you something that the Alliance of Her gave me. Sorry, this is mainly addressed to the women in the audience. We had a session on social media, and in particular with regards to social media and violence, and I'm saying violence because, yes, there's real violence, but also just trolling, online. They offered us this idea that, we all have a female network, a female support system already. We just probably don't think of it that way. It can be our friends, our colleagues, our family, and really creating, it's maybe a WhatsApp group, of women who will support you, where you can, send in a cry for help saying, I'm being trolled, can you please come to my rescue, and just write comments. And I thought that idea was brilliant. So I went back home and we did a group and we expanded it, and that's why I think it's interesting for you as well, even if you're not super active on social media. So what we did is I now have a WhatsApp group with 4 or 5 of my female colleagues, political colleagues, and we, with the sole purpose of raising each other up. So whenever something happens to us, something good, we will post it in the group and we will get cheers back. And by now, I don't even have to post anything in there. If something good happens, they will see it already. They will post it in there and say, go Anna, good for you. But it's also for supporting each other, for meeting, not just to chat, but to particularly talk about what are our plans for the future? What do we want to do? How can we support each other in that? You have a network already. You may just not think about it that way. Really try to use it as that, establish it as that, because I promise you, you'll be surprised about the positive feedback you get, about the amazing things that will come from that network. And that was actually the first, when I was asked to come here today, the first thing I did was go on my WhatsApp group and text my female supporters. And it is incredible. So please try that. I know it sounds super small and you might feel like, oh, but I talked to them already. Try doing that. It is incredible what it can do for you.
Yay. A big thanks to our most distinguished panel. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot. Hope you did too. I would like to honor your needs. We were supposed to be on coffee break now, but we've used it for the conversation. As you've seen in our agenda, at 3 o'clock, we're supposed to have Kira Rudik joining us from London. She's a member of Ukrainian parliament and vice president of ALDE party. I would love to really honor the fact that she decided to invest the time for us. So I would love to just give you the possibility to go and grab your coffee or take care of whatever needs you've got. But she's supposed to be joining at 3 o'clock. So whenever she's on, we will just start the conversation with her, and feel free to bring your drinks here, okay? I hope you don't mind. Thank you so much, and thank you all once again.
Hello. One second. I cannot hear you. Yes, one second. Yeah, let me just yeah. Hello, how are you doing? Yes, can you hear me? Okay. Okay. I arrived like 15 minutes ago. My flight was delayed from Indonesia, and I just like so everything is very hectic always. But G20 may be not a very bad event for us, and Rishi Sunak is doing a good job. He came out with a punch to Putin. Hello, Lucia. How are you doing? Okay, let me grab some water then. Okay.
Am I on? Thank you so much. Apologies for this rushed coffee break. I hope everybody's happy. You can come in and out with your coffees. A big part of our first panel conversation was about how we deliver a new quality and of policy and political solutions, especially because it's not about male versus female, it's about the feminine qualities that we stand for bringing into this space, and how the feminine qualities of creating new compromises with compassion and deep listening creates a possibility for new ways of collaborating. This is what we hope to hear from Kira also, as she's now in London, but we know how her realities are probably different these days, and how her presence in the Ukraine politics can be sort of an example of leading from a different space and values-based leadership. So I hope we have her still there. Kira, if you're still there, thank you for sharing your views on how feminine leadership can be a new method of creating solutions in international politics. Thank you. Thank you. We're ready for you. I don't know if she sees me. We're good? But we're on mute? Are we on mute? Yeah, that would be me. Oh, that's you? I don't know. Should we check?
Oh, fantastic. I'm ready too.
Should I repeat what I just said?
Yeah.
Hello, Kira. This is Lucia. I don't know if you heard me. I was just sharing about how the first panel touched a lot upon how the conversation about diversity in policy and politics isn't really about men versus female, but it's about feminine leadership that we would like to advance in international politics and security as a new way of generating solutions and lasting solutions to peace. So thank you for sharing your views.
Thank you so much. I hope that I heard everything, because for some reason the connection is so. So I heard like maybe not everything. Okay.
Apologies. I don't know if I should repeat or.
No. So
share with us what's on your heart when it comes to solving the situation that you're in now, that all of us are in.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Unfortunately, I cannot see you, but I hope that I will be able to deliver my message. We are right now at 9 months of the full-scale invasion that Russia started on Ukraine. And one of the reasons why we have such fantastic results that nobody believed at is that we are acting all together as one nation, one team, not only in terms of the fight, but also in politics, also in social area, also in humanitarian area, everywhere. We are acting as one. And this is the key to the success in war, well, basically in any case. One of the points about female leadership is that in Ukraine, we actually, as women, had the luxury to make our own choice to what to do when the full-scale invasion started. We could have gone to and joined the army, and I'm proud to say that right now 20% of Ukrainian army is women. We could have gone to territorial defense. We could have gone and use our skills as volunteers. We could have helped refugees. We could have immigrate with children and find a safer place somewhere else. So there was no limitation of what women can or cannot do. And I think that was one of the key features that allowed us to stand so strong. I like to say that when Putin was planning an attack on Ukraine and he was looking at our army, he only calculated men, but there were also women, and this is why we were so successful in pushing him back. And I know that you are following the news. 2 days ago, Ukrainian forces have liberated city of Kherson. This is the largest city that had been captured by Russians since the beginning of the invasion. And so you can imagine how happy and cheerful we are. It is said that the wars are fought by men and the countries are rebuilt by women. And this is very much true because right now we see a huge change and switch in the force, in labor force, in involvement in all kinds of projects, because this is true, men are going to fight and men are going to work at the military and make sure that they protect and defend our country. And for us, it is, with all the choices that we have, we also see that the demand on having person who will be stable emotionally and physically and able to work and produce value, it is an incredibly important for the country and for our nation thing. So this is why there are so many things on our shoulders. And in terms of policy and politics, there were the things that allowed us to have this freedom. There were certain things. Well, first of all, it was quotas for the political parties and for the elections. 40% of party list was supposed to have people of one gender. And it worked very well for us because right now, when like almost half of the local councils went to war, all the local councils right now like consist mostly of women who didn't go to war and who took the responsibility to continue operating on the local level. Then there was Istanbul Convention that we have voted on the second month of full-scale invasion of war as the final piece of the puzzle to get the candidacy to European Union. It was an incredibly important point for us. For 12 years, Ukraine was not able to ratify Istanbul Convention by various reasons, but we have seen that when there is a wish, there is a way, and all politicians, even the most conservative ones, have voted for a ratification because it was the last thing that was stopping us of getting the candidacy to the United Union. Aside of policy and politics and female leadership, I want to tell you some of the personal stories that I think are very important to understand what is happening and how things are going. I come from a pretty poor family, from the small city on the border with Slovakia. Since I was a little girl, I really hope that I will work very hard and I will be successful. And then when I became an IT entrepreneur, I was thinking that the goal that my generation has is to build a country so that the next generation will not have to go through everything that we have gone through, not have to go through the breakup of Soviet Union, then poverty, then revolutions, then war, everything that we will handle that, and the next generation of kids will be spoiled and free and they will be happy and allow themselves to do whatever they want and need and build their new fantastic country. That was my goal. That was my mission that I came to politics with. And now we are robbed of this mission. Now we are robbed of this chance because we have a generation of children who have seen dead bodies, who know how to act during air raid sirens, who know how to sit for like weeks in the bomb shelters, who know their blood type, who know how to act during the nuclear attack if there would be some, and right now who know how to sit for 2-3 weeks without electricity and running water and warm food. And this is so painful because it will have a huge impact on on Ukrainian nation in generations. And we will have to be creative on how to fix it for them, but also how to fix it for ourselves. I have been to Kiev since the day one of war, and for the first 3 months, I didn't leave my apartment, almost like not, well, maybe a couple of times. And I was sitting in the bomb shelter. I was going through all the bombarding. And then 3 months after, I went to Warsaw to one of the forums, and it was my first international trip. And you know, on the day one, I was jogging in the park in Warsaw, and there was an ambulance passing by with the siren on. And I did not realize it, like in just 2 seconds, I was already down on the ground, covering my head with my hands. And I'm a strong 37-year-old woman who doesn't have psychological problems. I cannot even imagine what is happening to people who survived much worse things that I did, who have actually seen all the frustration and killings and occupation. And for us, it would be another lesson of unity and support of each other to go through that. I like to say, when there's something bad, when there is another bombarding or another threat, or we find another mass grave, I like to say that we are heartbroken, but we are not broken. But the question that we all will have always will be where to find the strength, where to find the ability of this resilience to go on every single day, no matter how hard and how desperate it may be. And my answers are very simple. I still think that we should be on the mission to grow up a generation of Ukrainian children who would forget the war, but not the lessons of the war, and will be able to live happily and build a country that we all have dreamed of. And I think that on this path to this dream and this mission, we have been kicked very hard, but the mission is not lost yet. On this mission, we will have to rely on each other more than we ever done. And I think on this 9 months, we have learned to do it a lot. When you have to leave your children with a stranger just to get them to the safety. When you have to trust, when you are away, that your neighbors will take care of your family. That when you are protecting your home and every single day there's somebody else on a watch out, you trust people that you basically have never seen, but you know that your life is in their hands. So to move forward, both in winning the war and in recovering after winning the war and building the new prosperous future, the main lesson that we learned was the lesson of unity. Unity between European countries, unity between democratic countries of the world, but also unity between people who have never seen each other, but are supporting each other. And unity between women who are the ambassadors of rebuilding the country. No matter we want that or not, the lessons that were learned through the previous wars are here. Men are fighting the war and women are rebuilding. And the mission of having to recover the next generation is also on us. And with that, we will have to be easier on each other. With that, we will have to know that collaboration right now is a matter of survival. And the support of each other is a matter of survival. But it is also a matter of love, friendship, and collaboration that we have never experienced before. And I have seen so much pain and so much suffering and destruction and atrocities and dead bodies and things that should never happen in the 21st century. but I also have seen so much love with teachers who were taking buses and gathering children in the occupied city and somehow managed to get all of them out, saving them from death. I have seen people who managed to save hundreds of dogs and cats that were also doomed, and people returned for them. I have seen families in Poland and Czechia and Britain and other countries who have created homes for dozens of families who didn't have one, and continue doing so. And if there is anything that we should remember after the war, aside of all the moralistic things regarding security and preparation and international law, there is something very simple, that life always wins over death and good always wins over evil. And we do hope that we will be always on the good side. Thank you so much, and glory to Ukraine.
I'll speak here. Thank you, Kira. Do I speak into your computer or here? Where should I speak here towards so she sees me? Oh, wait. Apologies. Kira, can you hear
Hello?
me? Yes?
Yes, I can hear you, but
Thank you.
the sound very interrupted.
Thank you very much for your share. I know you have to go in a couple of minutes, so I would like to add one more question to it, and that's the one of mental health of people who embark on this journey as warriors like you in your country, but also in peace times in the other countries, people who are public servants, who are soldiers, who work in international organizations, who stand for building gender-just foreign policy and security, but they are going through their own struggles and they need support and they need to have resources, how to get resourced and inspired again so that they can go out and fight the battles they are supposed to fight. And so I wonder, in addition to what you've shared around your community, mobilizing resources and supporting each other, since we are at a policy event, what are your ideas for the gender-just foreign policy and security? How can we prepare foundation policy-wise so that the people who go out there and serve don't burn out along the way, but actually feel healthy and resourced to continue delivering on this mission, because obviously this is a marathon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This is a very important question. We like to idealize the way that women are serving in military, but we need also to accept that the situation is far from ideal yet. And I think one of the things that need to be provided to to both genders in military is a certain level of comfort that needs to be there. So and this can be made policy wise, first with the proper amount of time for the rotation. So this is one of the issues that we are having right now, when people who serve just continue serving and have not too many vacation days and ability to see their families, and this is critically important. So it is organizational matter that would need to be resolved, and in general. Second point of comfort, though it sounds very awkward when you are talking about the war, but there is a certain way of making things easier and not having every single minute of the existence a challenge, starting with the comfort with where the soldiers live, and of course for women a certain way of comfort in terms of the military uniform that is suitable for them, the shoes that are suitable for them, the the underwear that is suitable for them and is not an adjustment of male uniforms, but something that is actually developed to be comfortable. Like, for example, at the very beginning, the life vests for women were the same as for men, and it's actually very dangerous. I own one that I was given at the very beginning of the war, because we as women, we have breasts, so that that the metal part on the front of you is actually not safe the way that it fits. And only 4 months later, we have received a specially developed female protection vests that were actually had this how should I say it, for like new form factor. And there are so many things like that that can be helpful on an everyday life. Then we know that when people fight, they have constantly very high, and that's why when they return home, drop, and depression and inability to recover. This is why the additional psychological support is critical, is absolutely necessary, both for men and women who are serving in the army. These are the things that
Thank you. Well, I don't know. I would like to ask what's your takeaways, but it's kind of weird to say that. Let me invite our two distinguished panelists to the front of the room. We have Shada. Where's Shada? Do we have Shada with us? Oh, there are you. Please, come join us. We have Shada Islam, founder of New Horizons Project and editor of EU Observer magazine. I'm sure many of you already follow her work. And Damjan Denkovski, Deputy Executive Director of Center for Feminist Foreign Policy. Thank you both for your flexibility with accommodating this new schedule we had. And hello, thank you. Please grab whichever seat you feel like. I assume we are not counting on Kira coming back now? I see that she's there, but because she was supposed to be available until past, so I think she will just jump onto her other engagement. Yes. We had a Slido question there running about asking you about feminist foreign policy and how you feel about it. I don't know if any of you had a chance to express your views. Have you managed to put it up? Yes. And so, well, we'll see how the vote is going. Shada, I would like to ask you, many people think that it's a toothless policy that's used in a largely dysfunctional global system that needs to be transformed from scratch. And what's the point of talking about feminist foreign policy if then women come and try to do their magic in a system that's largely broken? And so my question for you is, what's your thoughts, also following the previous conversation, following Kira's keynote, having been part of the conversation for so long, do you feel is the right way of having this conversation? Is the policy one of the useful anchors to bring about change, or should the conversation be dealt with differently?
Thanks, Lucia. Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. I caught bits of what was said earlier, but let me just say, I think it's very good to bring in the feminist angle into conversations to do with foreign policy. But the world is a very complex place, and we're talking a lot about geopolitics. So I always say that I think it should be feminism in geopolitics, which goes beyond foreign policy, which talks about security policy, trade policy, development policy, and oh my God, migration policy. So I've never really understood, I have to confess, and I've been following this for some years, I've never really understood why we focus first and foremost on foreign policy. Is that because dealing with outside what happens in our own land is easier than to change the structures inside? And so for me, at the moment, it's not just that the system is broken, and God knows what's happening in Kira's country is a horrible example of how much the system is broken, but the system is a patriarchal one. It's a system which is based on very masculine traits. It's a system that is skewed in favor of hard security. A system which in our Europe today, when you have the topmost foreign policy official, Josep Borrell, really saying it very clearly, and thanks to him we now understand what Europe is about, unfortunately, that we live in a tidy little garden. He's, of course, the masculine gardener in this garden, keeping it nice and clean, and outside is this Orientalist other in the jungle, right? I mean, it's said so clearly. And that jungle, if we're not capable of sort of taming it, is going to invade us. And I've never had it said so clearly, so now, thanks to the system, we're saying certain quiet things loud. But that's a very, very patriarchal, masculine, toxic, poisonous, colonial, racist view of the world. And if you bring women into this already skewed system, already skewed structures, how much can a woman, even the most powerful woman, change that? So the system has to change, and that requires working inside us, not just outside us. And the women who have to come into it have to be powerful enough, confident enough, trustworthy enough, authentic, empathetic, all the things we've heard before, but they actually have to have the power to change domestic structures, to change the system.
Beautiful.
That's how I'll say it first.
The power of the feminine leadership, yes. Damjan, building on all that was said today, I would like you to bring in the intersectionality aspect and ask you, what does the research actually tell us about the feminist foreign policy, bringing about different quality of solutions, and if we add the intersectionality aspect to it, what becomes possible? Why is this important? Where is actually the business case behind this?
Sure. Yes.
Thank you.
Cool.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you also, firstly, to Shada for the input. I fully agree with almost everything in terms of that feminism should not just be relegated to foreign policy. It should very much encompass every single aspect of policy internally and externally. And I fully agree that the system is fundamentally broken and skewed in a patriarchal, masculinist way and oriented towards hard security. And we need to change it. And I think that's what feminist foreign policy is about. It's about creating structural change, or not about getting a seat at the table only, but about changing, or like sort of breaking the table and building a new, more just and more equal table. On the research, I think you also, it's in the panel description as well, that the research states that internally and externally, societies which have more gender equality or are just generally more equal are internally and externally more stable and less likely to engage in interstate conflict. So I don't think that it's a matter of making the business case for feminist foreign policy or making the business case for intersectionality. We do need to also make the sort of moral and principled case as well, because the business case is there. It's better for the economy, it's better for the way we see society, because we then take care of the unfair care burden, we take care of social policies that enable equal participation for everyone in society, we take care of we create better finance policies, more responsible and equitable responses to crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic. So all of these things are, the business case is there, and I would not necessarily restate it now. But I think maybe I would just like to refer to, because I remember seeing it in one of the Slido responses or questions earlier. One of the co-founders and co-executive directors of CFFP, Christina Lunz, she wrote a book called The Future of Foreign Policy is Feminist. That book came out on the 24th of February this year. All of the sort of promotional interviews and the launch of the book were already lined up, but as you can imagine, all of the questions immediately shifted to Ukraine, which I think is very fair. There was an acute crisis. What I don't think was fair was that the question was, okay, so what good is your feminism in foreign policy now, and how do you respond to this very hyper-masculinized form of aggression? And I think it was also stated in the previous panel that the way that Putin has been leading the war is very masculinized. It's very much focused on hard security. It's very much about framing Ukraine in feminine terms, and therefore it needs to be protected or rescued from whatever. And it's and Russia is sort of big and mighty and masculine. And I think it's firstly, I would preface it by saying that even in feminist foreign policy, you can have military responses as a matter of self-defense as a last resort, but it should not be the first response. So you cannot expect to fix a broken system that is militarized, and problems that have been caused by militarism and by a continuous cycle of armament. You cannot expect to fix them by more armament and more militarization. So that's where we need to, I think it's fair to say that we need to have policies everywhere. But if we talk about foreign policy, it still makes sense for it to be feminist, because it talks about disarmament, it talks about diplomacy, it talks about de-escalation, it talks about a different way of engaging, because feminists had been warning, I mean, since the annexation of Crimea in 2014, but also before, that we need to find a different way in engaging. Germany has been criticized for, in a way, financing the war because of its sort of awkward energy policy and the engagement with Russia over that. So these kinds of things are, that's why it needs to be a holistic issue, but it needs to be a holistic issue in multiple ways. It also cannot be essentializing the gender binary and talking about men and women as monolithic categories, because we know that that's not true. We know that there's more than two genders. We know that gender in, or even the women, peace and security agenda has often been seen as just add women and stir, or having a nice add-on to a gender-neutral problem such as security, which is not true. We haven't been sort of we have been securitizing gender instead of gendering security questions. And intersectionality brings in this, it's a lens that forces people to see that for any individual person, there are so many intersecting identities that create a very unique pattern of how we experience life, and that is what representation is about. So it's about having all, like, I think maybe it was you that mentioned like all the colors in society that need to be part of the conversation, but not just part of the conversation in sort of after the fact, but also setting the agenda, asking the questions: who decides what's a security issue? Gender-based violence, and especially online gender-based violence, is very often seen as a private matter and not as a security issue. And research is also showing that there's a need to link the women, peace and security agenda with preventing and countering violent extremism, because there's a very clear link between misogynist and anti-feminist ideologies as a mobilizing and unifying factor in violent extremist groups. So intersectionality is kind of not about counting, it's about going beyond counting women, but making women's presence count and creating meaningful patterns for participation. And I agree fully that there needs to be the space and the power to change and transform the system. And in order to do that, we need to change the system, but we can do that by just starting to act differently and not falling into patterns of, when the first crisis hits, to fall into patterns of militarization and only talk about sort of gender justice and feminism in peace and quiet times. Yeah, no, I mean, maybe I'll stop here and then we can continue with the rest of the conversation.
Thank you so much. Shada, Damjan floated a lot of stuff there, so I'll just leave you to comment on whichever piece speaks to you. I would also like you to add on the aspect of how it's not about getting more women at the table, but redesigning the table. And what is the concrete action that you feel the policy has been missing so far so that we move one step forward? We've met last time, a couple of weeks ago, at a conference of the European Gender Equality Institute, where it was all about hashtag 3 steps forward. And so it was all anchored in so much frustration and anger in the room, almost like we've been going to these conferences forever and we keep on asking, like, what next, what next? So what is your piece of wisdom on bringing this forward? Yeah.
Piece of wisdom, no, but I mean, based on experience, so I have to confess, and I heard it this morning or this afternoon from many of you, there is a sense of frustration that things aren't changing in the feminist world. All of us who believe in a feminist agenda, I'm not necessarily. The reason I'm so skeptical of feminist foreign policy is that it's been hijacked by a certain, I'm going to be very careful of the words I use, but a certain kind of Western white woman. And I don't know if any of you have read it. If you haven't read Against White Feminism by Rafia Zakaria, I really, really recommend that you read it. I've done a podcast with her. You can listen to it on EU Screams. And she says brown women can be white feminists too, right? So it's not just the color of the skin, but it's the content you bring to it, right? And the classic example, of course, is how the military intervention in Afghanistan against the Taliban was framed as a liberation of Afghan women from these horrible, horrible, barbaric Taliban. They're bad people, but it was Orientalist in its definition. And Donald Trump, when he got out of the Iranian nuclear deal in 2016, also framed it in terms of how Iranian women were not being treated as equal, which is very true, and we see now out on the streets, but Iranian women are doing it themselves. They have agency, they're empowered. They're authentic women, and they're doing it not just, the hijab is a very important symbol, but it's also for economic emancipation. The country is in dire straits. The country is literally on its knees. So feminist foreign policy, you know, will need to reinvent itself, and I'm actually quite heartened by the fact that it is being done. When I started working on it, intersectionality was not even a term that feminist foreign policy experts ever used. Race, color, religion, Orientalism, none of these figured. So we are evolving, and I think that's very, very encouraging, and I would say let's keep that up. Now, when I talk about geopolitics and the current state of the world, you have a very patriarchal, macho vision of the world that's being imposed on all of us, and I say that as a European. It's been imposed on us as Europeans, because Europe, when it started off its fantastic journey, was actually proud of its soft power, was actually proud of its international agenda of cooperation. It was actually proud of not just engaging in military adventures like the Americans do. It was proud of actually giving development assistance, technical assistance. And there were many things in that agenda that I found very inspiring, and that really created this strong bond I have with Europe as a European. But today, under the influence of a very macho agenda, you talked about Vladimir Putin and the bare torso, and how, you know, how important it is to be masculine, hard security. We as Europeans are being dragged. I mean, not just dragged. Some of us are actually, you know, embracing it with great enthusiasm and vigor. And we have this contradiction. Excuse me, I'm going to be very personal. We have a contradiction where you have the first time a European Commission president who's a woman. She comes into power and says it's all about geopolitics and we have to speak the language of power. I mean, the language of power she was speaking was a patriarchal, toxic, male vision of geopolitics, where it's only about us and them, where it's only about winner takes all. It's only about zero-sum games. It's only about great power confrontation. Sorry, is this the world we want to live in as Europeans? We've just seen what happens. So I think, you know, first of all, we really need to understand that just, and you've said it, all of you, I mean, all of us know, not just being a woman doesn't make you a feminist, just being white doesn't make you white, just being brown doesn't mean you're perfect or black. We have to change the content. And what I worry about is that we are getting carried away by mantras and slogans and wonderful Twitter feeds, hashtags, and we're not doing the work we need to do with our younger generations, with ourselves, about how we're going to decolonize. And I use that term very deliberately. decolonize our minds so we can really live and thrive in a multipolar world. A multipolar world where the table is not rectangular with a head and a, it's round. It's a round table with everyone, women, men, everybody has women and binary choices. No, people have flexibility, complexities, and those are recognized. In today's world, I'm sorry, the way it's being run now by our leaders, including our female leaders, I don't see how it's going to change. And I would like more Jacinda Arderns to actually come out there. I would like more Angela Merkels. I know a lot of, I would say, bad things are being said about her, but if you talk to many people, if they're authentic and honest, they will say that she did bring a very strong, you can call it inclusive, feminist, whatever you want to call it, but a kind of an emotion into this discussion which does not exist at the moment. So don't get me started is what I say, but you did get me started.
Thank you, we appreciate it. So before we hand over to you, please keep on sending your questions, because I feel this is getting juicy. Would you like to share, going one step further, Damjan, how to operationalize all of this? How do we turn all these labels that are floated around so that the decisions are taken with this principle in mind, that budgeting is assigned accordingly, that projects are supported, that embrace the values that we would like to see promoted in the society, and also how do we use this to shift, transmute the narrative that's out there in the society? We often see anti-feminist discourse. You mentioned the misogyny that we see all around. So how can we use this for concrete change on the ground and the conversation, and how the conditioning that we are all downloading from the society that we grow up in, how do we start unlearning that? You've also mentioned it's all about education, but the education that's out there isn't the education that's gonna awaken us to a different quality of activists and leaders in the society. So how do we embrace this sort of new leadership, new societal values by the system, so that it's not done just by the leaders who can afford, for instance, the leadership academies that so many of us are part of, but it's definitely not mainstream and accessible for everybody. It's a lot, I know.
Sure. Can I comment first quickly?
Please, yes.
Again, I agree with almost everything.
Where do you not agree? That's what's more
It's coming. So I think it's the sort of, I think the point that you raised about feminism only now sort of starting to engage with terms like intersectionality or a decolonial approach or an anti-racist approach is very fair, and there's a lot that the feminist movement has to go through in order to be the change that we're talking about today. And I think it's also very fair to acknowledge that there are many different types of feminisms. There is very much the problematic white feminism that is sort of just representative of essentialized white women. There is also there are also sort of local feminisms in every other culture, even if they go by another name. And these are, I think this is part of the colonial problem of exporting white feminism, but not engaging in the local terms, because that also often creates the resistance that we then sort of blame and use it to orientalize or essentialize the other. However, I think when talking about the term feminist foreign policy, it's really important to understand that it doesn't really mean the same thing for everyone, and it definitely doesn't mean the same thing for civil society and governments. I think I don't know if the term has been hijacked. I do know that it's becoming increasingly popular, and that also means that many actors are trying to put the label on themselves of being feminist or promoting a feminist approach to foreign and security policy. And we at the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy also find that somewhat problematic. So we call ourselves the critical friends of governments in this case, because we will encourage any and all actor to adopt a feminist approach to their foreign and security policy, but we will also critique it when it's not done right or it's seen to be instrumentalizing feminism or the labels of gender equality or gender justice. And just as an example, what I mean when I say that feminist foreign policy is not always the same, there are some countries that adopt nominally a feminist foreign policy, but don't include security as part of it. There are others that are only focusing on, for instance, France is focusing on feminist diplomacy. Mexico has a feminist foreign policy that on paper is quite holistic, and the foreign policy aspect of it is pretty good, but it is very much clashing with what's happening inside the country with the incredibly high rates of femicide in Mexico. So just reiterating the point that you made also earlier, I think aligning internal and external policy is extremely important in order to, we cannot just use it to promote something outside. We need to be able to also get our own house in order. We cannot sort of looking at the questions of ODA and technical assistance, or it needs to so okay, I need to take a little step back. So just to contextualize, I will because I'll come back to it in a second. I just wanted to sort of contextualize a little bit of how we at the center understand feminist foreign policy. So we work on trying to give the term meaning, and I think this is an ongoing process, and it does, there's a lot of learning to be done, and like Sweden hasn't published, but they already withdrew the feminist label from the policy, which I find to be a shame. But their analysis is still coming out. The analysis from Spain is also still not ready, and there hasn't been enough time to assess the kind of what feminist foreign policy in practice is doing, and feminist civil society has been trying to do that, and there will be more and more findings that will allow us to learn and to develop. So we're trying to develop the term, but we also work on peace and security as one core thematic area. We work on climate justice. We work on we work on anti-racism and sort of decolonizing feminism and decolonizing feminist foreign policy and decolonizing foreign policy in general, because those are also crucial aspects. We work on human rights for all with a very intersectional approach, and then we also work on development policy. And I agree fully that migration policy, trade, all of this should be very much part of how we do things. And for all of these, we also need to work internally. So just to give maybe a broader holistic vision, so the same way that we holistically need to understand the individual or the concept of human security, we need to understand feminist foreign policy, and it needs to be inclusive and representative in order to do what it's supposed to do. And I feel that sometimes critique like it doesn't respond to all the crises, or it has been hijacked, is slightly unfair, because it's expecting the concept of feminist foreign policy to carry this entire load of single-handedly fixing a system, but it's not a band-aid that can sort of, you can slap on, and we need structural change. And I think it was you that said it's a marathon. So another quick comment on the EU and the soft power, and then I will answer the actual question. I think the EU soft power approach was, I mean, a lot of it still focused on exporting outside, and while but inside, like we still, but at the same time, the border, like the EU external border, has been increasingly militarized. The way that refugees and migrants are being treated is also incredibly uneven and racist and discriminatory. We do have different approaches for different people, and this with the compounded crises that the world has been going through, from sort of the economic crash about 15 years ago through COVID to what's happening now, there is also a rise in right-wing nativist, anti-feminist and misogynist populism around Europe, and this is also, like you said, some of us are willingly going into the militarized harsh security pattern, because there is an exploitation of sort of gender equality is the problem, or like feminists are the problem. In Germany, I think they just published a study the other day where a shocking proportion, I think maybe 20-something% of young people in Germany think that feminism is a threat to society, and therefore the sort of growth of anti-feminist ideology is very much problematic. So but at the same time, the EU or the EES approach has often been very piecemeal in terms of gender equality, and on paper a lot of it is there. In practice, it's very disjointed, and it's not the institutionalization of the mainstreaming of gender equality is quite weak at the level of EU external action, and there needs to be. So we have an EU ambassador for gender and diversity, but we don't have gender just representation. You mentioned the example of Afghanistan. I fully agree that it was an incredibly gendered justification for the invasion in 20 years ago. We also see that now we had delegations from Europe going to negotiate with the Taliban to talk about the fundamental rights for women without a single woman present in the room. They also accepted not a single woman being present on the Taliban side of the negotiation. So it was just, again, a bunch of men talking about the fundamental rights of women, and you cannot, that goes against everything that, you know, the WPS agenda or gender just foreign policy would stand for. So to your question, I think giving all of these things life is about disaggregating the data to begin with. So first of all, that means investing in asking the right questions. It also means in trying to break it down in as many categories as possible so that we understand how our policies may be affecting people and whether the policy that we implement or choose to do in order to help one group of people will actually harm another group. It's also about, maybe tacking onto the example of the EAS, it's about mainstreaming an intersectional feminist approach across all policy issues, and it's the inside and outside coherence. It's very much about engaging with masculinities, because I was recently at an event where a woman was presenting. There was a picture, just I think it was a sketch even about a women's rights protest, and it was a group of women holding up signs, and a man in the audience raised his hand and said, "I feel excluded here, and I think that the term feminism is not good because I do not feel represented in this picture." I mean, apart from the audacity of claiming underrepresentation by the most represented group in sort of media, public life, etc., I think it raises the question of feminism is not, and I think one of the options that you had on the slide was before, like, the term is not inclusive. It very much is. Feminism is not about women versus men. Feminism is not about women as such. Sure, one of the big things is about rebalancing the power scales and trying to change structural inequality, but it's also about everyone else, including the white heterosexual cis male of the global north, because sure, they benefit from the patriarchy the most, but they also suffer under it, and it creates sort of engaging critically with masculinities is an important way to give these policies a bit of life. And I think the best thing that we can do for it to be instrumentalized by the anti-feminist narrative is to continue putting feminist policies on paper and approaching them piecemeal, but not actually responding to the problem at hand. And to the example of ODA, which is Overseas Development Assistance, we rely on the OECD DAC marker. So there's like the DAC marker 1 and 2, so about how gender inclusive the projects that are being funded by big donor countries are. And one of them is about sort of significant gender objective, and one of them is about primary gender objective. But they're, in a lot of ways, it's great that it's there, but it's also a box ticking exercise, because first of all, people don't know how to, governments sometimes just like tick boxes, literally, to indicate whether this project has a principal objectives. And we have, I think the German Federal Development Ministry recently, with the unveiling of the feminist development policy approach, set a very high quota or sort of goal of how many of the German development projects will be will have gender as a primary objective, and it's great. But it still looks at the gender binary. It still doesn't look at sort of all sectors of the way that overseas development assistance is being done. So if it's just on paper and it doesn't address social problems, then of course it's going to be instrumentalized, and of course all the critique that you levy then, Shada, is very fair, because it doesn't change anything. It's just a label that we use to make ourselves feel better in a world where it's kind of cool to be feminist, even though it's apparently also really dangerous to be a feminist, because there is growing anti-feminist violence around Europe. Hoping that it answered at least part of the actual question.
Thank you so much. Do we have questions in the audience? Okay, let's go for the questions. And in the meantime, if you want to check out the slide of questions so that you can start addressing them together as you wish, please. No, Sabah, go ahead, please, and then over to you.
Thank you so much. My name is Elisa. I actually work for the Federal Foreign Office, the German Foreign Office. And we're in the process of sort of trying to find out what our feminist foreign policy will be. And I think when you mentioned that it's about geopolitics, in our foreign policy, we have all other sectoral issues represented. And I think that's something that we, a group of also young female colleagues, fought very hard for and manage now to get recognized, that it should especially be about resources and how resources are allocated, because this is you're not protecting women, you're actually empowering them to create change. So I would strongly sort of make the case for including economics and resource allocation and finance in all of this. And thank you. These have been incredibly inspiring sessions, and I have the feeling we focus a lot on who and what. And my question would be, what about the how and why? Because I think the why has kind of been always assumed that everyone in this room, we probably know why. And that also we have a question there online saying that, how can it improve? How can gender equality improve foreign and security policy? I think it doesn't go without saying. I think many people do not know why. In terms of content, I'm not talking about the norm of equality. I'm talking about really sort of concrete evidence. So I would like to hear more about that if you have any examples, because we need these talking points, when we're not talking to an audience which is convinced already. So that would be the first question. The second would be how, because I was, maybe this is also more for Damjan also. When I'm thinking about the status quo in, for example, my institution, but I'm sure lots of us have this problem that, or not problem, this situation that you have many male colleagues who maybe are just indifferent. I wouldn't even say it's what we had on the panel before about, are they allies or enemies? I would say they just really have not thought about this, do not see the need, don't have time, don't understand why it's important. They pay lip service when they have to, but otherwise it's not on their agenda. So how do you confront that? How do you go from actors and agents towards sort of processes and content that these people who are so far indifferent can actually use in their work? Thank you.
Hello. Oh, yeah. My name is Zoe. I'm a freelance journalist. Thanks for your comments. There is a lot I'd like to pick up on, but I'd like to follow up on your comments about the how and the why. I think, we can talk about these things at very high levels of theory, but the reality is, what would feminist policy really look like in, for example, the situation in Ukraine? I thought it was also fascinating when we heard from our speaker from Ukraine, speaking just about real life things like protection for women that would fit their bodies properly. Also just the question of, should women be encouraged also to be allowed to fight, not just 20%, but should it be 50-50 women going out to fight alongside the men if we really are interested in gender equality? And also, why do we keep talking about gender and feminism if really what we're talking about is a more humanist approach? To me, why don't we talk about humanism? Why do we need to get hung up on the term feminist? Because of course that immediately tends to alienate some people. They go, oh, women stuff, just don't have the time. Why aren't we just talking about human beings? Because that's what we all are, first and foremost. Thank you.
I feel it's very important to observe our community and stakeholders we serve in their whole diversity. I remember when I worked on equality mainstreaming at the European Commission's Department for Internal Market on mainstreaming gender equality in our standardization policy, which is exactly what the vests are about. Like, when are we setting the request for standard as European standardization organizations? Who are the people in the room who are approving the budgets and the specs, and who are they thinking of as the final users of the product, right? So what are you hearing?
So I totally agree with what you're saying, humanistic approach. That's why I use the word inclusive, because I think it's more, possibly more modern in today's world. Look, let me just go back just a little bit. So we live in an ecosystem, right? So we're talking about foreign policy and the leaders and foreign ministers and foreign ministries, but it's the entire ecosystem, right? So how can we better communicate when I used to be a journalist, I still am a journalist in many ways, as also a think tanker. Our academia is male dominated. Our think tanks are male dominated. Our media is male dominated. It's not diverse. I mean, I work a lot on anti-racism. I'm part of the Brussels So White movement. In fact, I sort of quasi-lead it. And I don't mean just white in terms of color, which is of course the case as well, but also in terms of thinking. We're all thinking the same. And Walter Lippmann said years ago, when everyone's thinking the same, nobody is thinking. So we're all sort of totally regurgitating the same old narratives about what Europe is, what power is. I mean, you talk about power and nobody talks about smart power. It's all about the military muscle. That's what you were saying. We've securitized security, so it's only about hard security. And the ecosystem, I can tell you, I've been a journalist, I'm a think tanker, and you know, I'm the rare brown woman in the room of Muslim descent to beat it all, you know. Oh my God, Orientalism doesn't get any worse than that. And often the only woman too, right? So, I mean, this is a very, very, Brussels and our capitals are male dominated. And of course they're promoting women. And the how, of course, is affirmative action. I think that's the European Union has done a good job of it, the institutions, but it has made no impact on content. Look at the security strategies that are coming out. They talk about a stronger, more powerful Europe, and they don't define what that means because they know it only means hard power. It means military muscle. And I'm not a pacifist. You know, I was born in a country which has been perpetually at war. I was born in Pakistan. I know the importance of having defense. But as you said, we actually have to first prioritize collaboration. And the why we need more women and we need more diversity is because we need to actually, what's our goal? Is it peace and prosperity, which I think it is? And how do we get there? Is it by ruining our environment? Is it by killing more people? Is it by starvation, by energy shortages, climate change? And if all of those things are important, why aren't we working towards it? So I just don't understand what's happening in the world today. We have this wonderful conference happening in Sharm el-Sheikh and in Bali at the same time. You know, the US and China are at loggerheads. So we need to make up our minds. And I'm not sure that feminist foreign policy or feminist overseas development aid is actually going to change that. Because women are not putting the emphasis on these. I mean, I know a lot of European women ambassadors. They're wonderful women. But what can they change? How can they change things when the instructions coming from headquarters is about the jungle? How embarrassing is that? I also want to say, you know, so one of the things that really bothers me is that the far right is promoting women. I mean, you know, if you're talking about feminist leadership in Europe, I'm sorry to say, it's really coming from the hard right. Meloni, Marine Le Pen, others, I won't name them, they're all there. And why is that the case? Let's ask ourselves that question. And I think the answer is very simple. It's because they don't question the order. They don't question the masculine hierarchical order that's been set there. They join it. I just read somewhere in the FT, I think, Meloni wants to be called Il Presidente. The masculine term. She doesn't want to be called La Presidente. So they're adopting all the masculine traits in order to move up the hierarchical, patriarchal ladder. And so, I mean, these are things I think we need to think about. And I encourage your organization to go down the route of decolonization and try and bring that onto the EU agenda, because that's one word that you will not hear any EU person ever articulate: decolonization, anti-racism agendas. These are not things that we're doing. And we're not doing it because we still believe in a very us and them divisive discourse, which we're seeing in the migration debate. And on migration, once again, we have a clash between the feminist agenda, which I would argue is put forward by Ylva Johansson as the migration commissioner, who has tried to normalize migration, talks about living together, inclusion, and the rest of it. And then by others who are working on migration, including Margaritis Skinas, who is there to promote the European way of life, which is the dog whistle to the far right, if ever there was one. Or von der Leyen, who goes to Greece and talks about the shield that Greece is against migrants. So we've got this constant paradoxical conversation going on, which makes it very difficult to communicate. What is Europe today, you know? So I encourage you also at the Foreign Ministry in Germany to take account of all the contradictions that we have within us as a Europe, and to try and see how we can actually streamline and have a coherent, cohesive approach, with whether it's feminist, inclusive, humanistic, that's besides the point, but more in tune with today's world.
First, I think it's, and both to your intervention, Shada, now, and to your question, I feel that it's a bit of an unfair or like characterization of what feminist foreign policy is, or what feminism is in general, and I'll explain why I think that in a second. But to begin with your question, like with the indifference of a lot of people, it's not just men, it's also like a lot of women who are also in established bureaucratic positions, in like especially foreign ministries are old and established institutions with a lot of rules and hierarchies and procedures of working, and changing that fundamentally takes a lot of time. And I think one of the things that we recommend to governments who are wishing to pursue a feminist approach to their foreign and security policy or any other policy is to and that's what I meant when I talked about institutionalizing and the mainstreaming, is to really do that. And this has to be a top-down approach on the one hand, where the definition and the explanation of what feminist foreign policy means needs to be also then shared in terms of through trainings, through staff development, through whatever it might be, in order for people to understand why they need to make the effort to actually change their mind and not to make it indifferent. And then, and this is where I think one of the fundamental disagreements that I have with your point is that that's when the decisions from top down or from the top are not about like Europe is a garden, because when you adopt earnestly a feminist approach to foreign policy, then you should have, and that's what we advocate for, a decolonial, anti-racist, and also whole of society approach. So this is why I feel that the characterization of sort of feminist foreign policy is unfair if it's similar to, I don't know if it was the wrong word, or if you meant it in that way, but I think you said that feminist leadership in Europe is coming from the far right. That's not true. They are women, sure, and there is a whole area of studies that's looking at the feminization of nativism and populism as well, and the using of women in these kinds of, or the participation of women in these kinds of policies and ideologies, and that's something that we should definitely engage with. But I would categorically disagree that they're feminist in any way. Like Giorgia Meloni is very, but this is the problem, I think, conflating those terms and saying woman equals feminism is not true. And this is also, when we talk about the statistics and the research, women in leadership positions does not by default equal better policies, and just because women can be as anti-feminist as anyone else. And I also had, I think I have to raise the point, and I'm fully aware of my positionality as a sort of cis man sitting here, but if you talk about feminine qualities of leadership and assuming that all women will bring the same qualities to leadership it's also wrong. Like there's all, and we talked about it in the previous panels, there's different women are not a monolithic category, and so are all other like neither is any other group. So looking at the process, looking at the content is about learning all of this. It's about learning an intersectional approach and learning that all of us have all of this. So to illustrate, like you have, when you're developing let's say an overseas like development assistance project or a response to a crisis in foreign policy, and maybe we can link it to Ukraine now. The reason that I brought up the fact that my colleague's book came out on the day of the invasion is that the question that was raised was, right, so what is your feminism good for now? What is your de-escalation and diplomacy good for now? And this is also why I find that question also unfair, because what feminists have always been faced with is the question of sort of, here is a crisis, you have 30 seconds and zero money to fix it, and if you don't, then you're pointless or you're a naive feminist. And I think that's, well, unfair, because it's unfair to put on feminism to sort of repair in one moment the broken system that it has been advocating for changing for the longest time the moment that the crisis happens. So then we need to, if we de-escalate and if we focus on diplomacy, then we can prevent the next crisis. And this is how sort of institutionalizing the women, peace and security agenda should be, not just about the effects of war, but also about the causes of war and what leads to that and what leads to stability afterwards. So of course, like I said, if you have as a last resort in need of self-defense, sure, we can also talk about weapons deliveries. We absolutely should talk about making bulletproof vests that are not modeled on one type of body. That is absolutely true. And I mean, as feminists, we also talk about the pink tax, which is the sort of in a lot of European countries still, the luxury VAT being applied to menstrual hygiene products, right? This is a thing that we all need to fight against. So I'm fully with you on that. I'm also sort of, there is space to talk about, if we need to, about arms deliveries. But what a feminist approach to that would not be to say, no, let's not send any weapons because, or no, let's not engage in any way because we don't believe in war. Of course we don't believe in war. I mean, it shouldn't be, it's never a solution. It never leads to peace or never leads to anything better. But what we would need to do if we wanted a feminist response is to ask the question, what happens to those small arms and light weapons that get sent afterwards? Like, how are we tracking what's happening there? Because research tells us that in post-conflict societies, an increased number of small arms and light weapons that get sent to these conflict contexts lead to an almost immediate increase in gender-based violence. So that's the important part, the important question that we need to be asking. And this question does not get asked in a hard security paradigm. Like, that's why we need to think about how are these policies affecting all of these different categories of people and all of these different identities. So yeah, I mean, ultimately it's not really, you know, about whether or not women should be encouraged to join the military or not, or whether there should be a 50-50 quota. People should do whatever they feel is right for them, and there shouldn't be there's no position one way or the other. But a feminist approach to all of these issues is about looking at it from beginning to end as a process and thinking about it from the perspectives of every single kind of person that we can think of in order to make sure that they're not being harmed by any of these policies. And if we look at feminism and feminist foreign policy in that way, and not the way that it's sometimes characterized or instrumentalized, which, or unfortunately mischaracterized, then we can talk about how it can change over time. And the more and more countries do that, then it can happen. But it won't fix everything tomorrow, because it's an unfair assumption to expect that.
I totally agree with you. And if I use the word feminist leadership coming from the far right, I made a big mistake. I meant women are rising faster in far right politics. And you know, they don't have to all be white. I mean, we've had some terrible brown women in charge in the UK, for instance, migration policy, among other things. So I'm not, on the questions that you say have to be asked about tracking the weapons and knowing that gender-based violence increases in times of crisis, economic or military crisis, by the way, and we're headed for a deep economic crisis as well. And we know from past experience that we're going to have more gender-based violence during those times. We know all that, right? Well, why is it then, and this is something that I ask myself, why is it then that when we're talking about it, when policies are being made, we know that women are there at the table, promoted by the EU through affirmative action, very, very good, very proud of it. More women MEPs are there. In the think tank world, media, women are coming in slowly. And why doesn't anyone have the courage, the audacity, the authenticity to put that question on the table? I have not heard it. And I would love to hear it. I would love to have more women asking those questions in these very difficult times, saying, why are we ignoring the global south? Why are demands for climate reparation being turned away? Why are TRIPS waiver for vaccines not being allowed when we know that people are dying and there will be more pandemics? Why is hunger allowed to go on? Why are there grain shortages in Africa at the moment? So why aren't those questions being asked? And that's what makes me really worried, because it's not as though we don't know these things, but when policies are being made and when policies are being discussed in foreign policy or development policy fora, I can assure you, I am part of these conversations a lot, and it requires a lot of courage, and you're totally excluded. People turn to you and say, well, you don't get it. You know, this is not all, this is about power, this is about importance of Europe, etc. These questions aren't raised. So I'd like to have them raised, and I'd like to know from you, or any of you, how can we make sure that the media picks it up, that the think tank world, the academia, talks about it as well. And we don't. We know that we should do it, and we don't do it.
20 seconds, yeah. I agree, those questions should be asked, and I agree that you know, that they're often not. That's because, like I said, not every woman is a feminist, and not everyone who is a man is not a feminist. So it, but all of our systems were built under the patriarchy and still follow patriarchal rules, and it takes a lot of unlearning to do that. And this is why also just elevating some women does not equal feminism, because then you're also elevating those who are already more privileged, come from urban environments, are highly educated, can speak a certain way, can participate in a certain sort of social setting, using the right words, and are not being told to sit down. There's also, we talked about the challenges of women's participation in politics or in society in general. Like, there's also a lot of silencing and discouragement and all of that happening. So I fully agree with all of that. And one answer to your question is the role of civil society, and the kind of civil society asks a lot of the uncomfortable questions often, and politics kind of often follows. They rarely lead. So supporting civil society more to do that is an important part of it. And I think this reminded me, this is why I raised my hand, to the other part of your question on why don't we call it a humanist foreign policy, because the definition of who is human is very often brought sort of something that excludes people. When we can, the reason that we want to talk about feminist foreign policy is because it, for us at least, stands for intersectional approaches and for a very much justice oriented solutions to all of these problems and challenges. So calling it a feminist foreign policy is the way that we are being audacious or courageous to actually, because it would be easier to just say gender equality or humanist, yes, but it doesn't do it justice, because it needs to be radical, it needs to be different, and it needs to be intersectional. And when it does that, then sometimes questions like this get raised about why it's not called a humanist, but it's much more inclusive than any of these other terms. And in that sense, it's radical and transformative. Sorry, thank you.
Beautiful, thank you so much. I would love to continue. Unfortunately, we can't, but we still can continue with coffees in the other room. Thank you very much for your contributions. I'm not sure I know what is the one step forward, but maybe for each of us, there's a little piece that we can start becoming voice for in our bubbles. Many thanks for Friedrich-Naumann Stiftung for making this happen. I'm looking forward to the continuation of these debates. Good luck to the team to start keeping it as a priority in the Brussels bubble. I'm really grateful for the conversations we had today. Please stay in touch. You know where to find us. For those joining the working group, the meeting starts in 10 minutes in the Copernicus room, somewhere here across the hall. And that's it from me. Thank you so much. It's been an honor.